Walter Pruitt was 61 years old when the letter finally arrived, and the greenhouse around him still smelled the way it always did after a hard rain: wet limestone dust, crushed leaves, and underneath that, faint and warm, the bittersweet smell of chestnut bark that a botanist had once had to explain to him before he could name it himself. The air inside held an October heaviness that had nothing to do with the chill outside. It fogged his glasses the moment he stepped through the door and stayed fogged. Somewhere behind him a radiator pipe ticked twice as it cooled, the same pipe that had been ticking, on and off, since 1908. Ahead of him, past 40 feet of iron and glass, 3 chestnut trees stood taller than the section of roofline someone had once cut away to let them grow, their canopies gone the deep gold of the season's first real cold. He was holding a letter that valued those 3 trees and the exclusive rights to propagate them at 34,014,760 cendrons. He read the number twice before he let himself sit down on the potting bench, which was, as of that morning, the only clean surface left in a building he still called the wreck out of habit rather than accuracy. The bench had been sanded and resealed that spring. Nearly everything in the greenhouse was new or newly repaired by now, except the 3 trees themselves and the tag on the nail beside him. To his left, wired to a nail driven into that bench long before he was born, hung a small brass tag tarnished nearly black, stamped with a single numeral. He'd walked past it for months without asking what it meant. He knew now. He left it exactly where it was, because some things earn the right to stay where they were put. What follows is drawn from Walter's own account, from the Chester County probate file, and from a breeding ledger that had sat behind a brick panel untouched for 53 years. Along with entries in his grandfather's hand going back even further to 1904, the year a blight nobody could yet name began killing American chestnuts by the millions, and one member of the Pruitt family decided, quietly, and without telling a soul why, to try to save a few. The greenhouse around him, every pane reglazed, every hinge oiled, the old coal boiler finally, permanently silent, was worth, according to that letter, considerably more than the mansion 400 yards up the gravel drive. The mansion that had gone to his brother. The mansion his brother had never once, in 6 decades, called anything but the real inheritance. That number, though, was still 6 months away. On the March afternoon, Garrett stood at the head of their father's dining table, cleared his throat, and began reading the will out loud. Garrett read the will the way he read everything, like a man confirming what he'd already decided to expect. 6 of them sat around a table that had been in the family since before any of them were born. Garrett, 66, a man who'd been afraid of the dark until he was nearly 12, and would deny it to this day if you brought it up, in a brand-new quilted barber jacket, tags still tucked inside the collar, as though he'd dressed for a photograph rather than a funeral reading. Beside him, his wife Deborah turned one of her miniature porcelain birds over and over between 2 fingers, a habit she'd had since before Walter had known her. Their 2 grown children sat texting, and Walter, 61, wore the same flannel shirt he'd worn to the burial itself, because he owned exactly 1 good shirt and had already used it. Harold Pruitt had died at 91, and the will divided what he'd left the way everyone at that table had quietly assumed it would for years. The mansion, 41 acres, controlling shares in the family's development firm. The investment accounts. All of it went to Garrett, who had spent 38 years building that firm up from the modest outfit their father had started, and who had never once let anyone at that table forget it. Walter got the greenhouse, the potting shed beside it, 6/10 of an acre of ground so overgrown the fence line had disappeared into it years ago. For estate tax purposes, the attorney's cover letter valued the whole parcel at $1. Well, Garrett said, not quite looking up from the page, one hand finding his wife's shoulder, as though bracing for her reaction more than announcing his own. "At least Dad gave you something that suits you, a little glass box full of dead men's hobbies, out where nobody has to look at it." Deborah didn't disagree. She set her bird down on the table, glass meeting wood with a small, precise click, and said it was almost sweet, really. Harold leaving Walter the one thing on the whole property that had never once been worth the taxes on it. Nobody at that table knew, because nobody had ever thought to ask, that the number on the appraisal had been wrong since 1962, the year a county assessor walked the property line without setting foot inside the greenhouse itself, marked the file, condemned, agricultural, no reassessment required, and closed it. No one had reopened that file since. Not the assessor's office, not Harold, who had every reason of his own not to, and certainly not Garrett, a man who had built an entire career on knowing precisely what land was worth, and had simply, in this one case, never bothered to ask. Walter said thank you, because that was what a person said, and folded the letter into his shirt pocket, and did not let himself cry until he was alone in his truck in the circular drive, holding a set of keys to a building he hadn't set foot inside in 11 years. The date, for the record, was March the 14th. It would be 158 days before Walter drove back out to that property to see what, exactly, he'd been given. He didn't know yet that his father had spent the better part of a decade making sure the son who wouldn't be in a hurry was the one who'd eventually find out why that mattered. Turnpike toll records would later show Walter's truck passing the Downingtown interchange at 11:14 that morning, the 19th of August, 158 days, almost to the hour, after Garrett had cleared his throat at the head of that dining table. His phone shows one call placed before that, at 7:03 a.m., 9 minutes long, to his daughter Meg in Pittsburgh, who had never in 30 years managed to keep a single houseplant alive, despite what she called growing up with the greenhouse whisperer for a father, and who told him, that morning, that he didn't owe the property anything. He could sign the 6/10 of an acre over for scrap value and never think about it again. He told her he just wanted to see it once, properly, before he let himself decide that the estate attorney had warned him the place had gone feral. Walter hadn't understood what that meant until he turned off the county road and the lane narrowed to 2 ruts with grass growing tall down the middle, and the mansion came into view first. Repainted already, new gutters, a contractor's dumpster parked where the old rose garden used to be, and then past it, almost swallowed behind 40 years of self-seeded maple saplings, the greenhouse. Half the panes were gone or spider-cracked. A whole section of the iron frame had rusted through and folded inward like a bent knee. The smell that met him at the door was mildew and standing water, and underneath that, something green and stubborn that hadn't given up on itself. Inside, the temperature dropped 10 degrees and the humidity climbed just as fast, the way it does in a room that's been quietly making its own weather for 100 years without anyone's permission. Somewhere near the back, water dripped in a rhythm too, even to be a simple leak. A pipe, still pressurized, still doing its job, long after everyone who understood it had died. He spent the better part of an hour just standing in the doorway. Nearly everything inside had died. The ornamental beds along the south wall had gone black and collapsed. A climbing rose that had once been trained flat against the brick, espaliered, his grandmother's word, one of maybe 3 things he could still remember her teaching him, had gone to bare, thorned wood, dead at the root by every appearance. But in the back corner, where a section of roof panels had been removed decades ago and never replaced, 3 trees stood green and whole and enormous, easily 30 feet, their bark smooth and pale in a way that struck him, even from across the room, as wrong. Something about the leaf shape nagged at him, familiar and unplaceable at once. Everything else in that building had died from nothing more complicated than neglect. Whatever those 3 trees had going for them, 11 years of neglect hadn't laid a hand on it. He came back the following week with gloves, a wheelbarrow, and no plan beyond clearing enough dead growth to see the floor underneath it. What he found over 11 days spread across 3 separate weekends was less a cleanup than an excavation. On the 4th day, in a built-in cabinet under the north bench, he found a bundle of receipts and invoices tied with twine gone brittle enough to snap at a touch. Most were unremarkable: coal deliveries, glazing repairs, a 1931 order for rose stock that made him laugh out loud alone in an empty greenhouse. One, dated the 12th of June, 1908, itemized the original installation of the heating system. A coal-fired boiler, 210 feet of iron pipe, and 6 valve-controlled radiator returns. He counted the valve wheels along the pipe run on the north wall. 5. He told himself it was nothing. A 6th valve pulled decades ago and scrapped for the brass. He told himself that for 4 more days, while he worked the same wall inch by inch, tapping pipe joints, checking under every bench, finding nothing. His knees complained about the concrete more with every visit. By the 7th day, he'd started bringing a foam pad to kneel on and calling it, privately, exactly what it was: stubbornness with cushioning. Garrett texted once that 2nd week, asking if Walter needed a hand hauling junk to the dump, an offer that never once turned into an actual visit. It was on the 9th day, tired enough to consider quitting for good, that Walter looked up at the brass tag stamped 6, still wired to its nail, and understood for the first time that it wasn't decoration. It was a label. For something that wasn't where he'd been looking: the espaliered rose, the dead one, trained flat against the brick since before his grandmother's time, ran directly beneath where the 6th valve should have sat. He found it on the 10th day, a small brass wheel, painted over in the same flat green as the pipe behind it, bolted where a live steam valve belonged, but wired, once he'd cleared enough dead cane to see it properly, to nothing. No pipe threaded through it at all. It had never once controlled heat. What it was wired to was the rose itself. One specific low branch, run through a drilled hole in the mortar and anchored, somewhere inside the wall, to a mechanism he couldn't see. He pulls the branch before he lets himself think better of it. Nothing happens for a full second. Then, with a grinding sound like a drawer that hasn't opened in 50 years, an 18-inch section of the brick planting bed, directly beneath the rose, lifts an inch on a hidden hinge, a counterweighted bolt latch finally letting go of something it had been holding since 1971. He gets his fingers under the edge and lifts the rest of the way himself. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth gone stiff and yellow with age, sits a document box, lead-lined, no bigger than a bread pan, heavier than it looks. His hands are shaking badly enough that he has to set it on the bench before he can work the corroded latch. Inside that a ledger, its pages brittle at the edges, but the ink still dark. Entries running from 1904, clear through to 9 sets of hand one in 3 distinct sets of handwriting. A single page assignment notarized sealed unbroken, signing over all propagation rights, present and future, in the resistant chestnut line developed on this property, to whichever of Harold Pruitt's children showed, in his father's own words, patience enough to look for it, and not merely to inherit it. And tucked into the very back of the box, a letter, 4 lines long, in handwriting Walter hadn't seen since a birthday card 30 years gone. If you're reading this, you either loved these trees enough to go looking, or you have your grandfather's patience, which comes to the same thing in the end. Don't let anyone tell you a greenhouse is nothing. Ask a forester what a living, blight-resistant chestnut is worth these days. Then ask him to sit down before you tell him how many we have beneath his father's signature on the assignment page, in the cramped, unpracticed hand of someone barely into their teens sat a second signature Walter read 4 times before he let himself trust it. Witnessed, 9th day of April, 1971. Garrett H. Pruitt, age 13. He would later describe what he did in the next hour in 8 words. I called Priya before I even stood up at the time. He said nothing at all, just sat down on an overturned bucket in a ruined greenhouse, holding a piece of paper that made him one of the wealthier men in the county, and cried for reasons that had very little to do with money. Priya Nandakuma picked up on the second ring. She was a plant pathologist with the county extension office, 15 years past her doctorate, and she still kept, on the corner of her desk, a small jar of soil from her grandmother's farm outside Kochi, the kind of detail Walter had noticed on his one visit to her office, and never mentioned again, right up until it mattered. It mattered now. He read her the ledger entries over the phone, then the assignment page, then, self-conscious, the letter. She went quiet long enough that he asked if the call had dropped. "Send me photos of the bark," she said instead. "Today now, Walter." 3 days and 1 very long site visit later, sitting on the same overturned bucket he'd cried on, she told him that if the trees were what the bark and leaf structure suggested, he wasn't looking at a family curiosity. He was looking at one of the only confirmed blight-resistant American chestnut lines in the country, the exact kind of restorationed material a certain forestry restoration consortium had spent the better part of a decade quietly trying to find. He told Garrett 2 days after that, a call he would come to regret, though not yet, not while he still half expected his brother to simply be glad for him. He told him because Garrett was still his brother, because some habits outlast whatever caused them, and because it did not occur to him on that first phone call that Garrett would hear the number before he heard the word chestnut. Garrett's Range Rover knew enough that the dealer plates were still bolted on. First appears on the greenhouse's newly installed security at 62 that evening, 5 days after the call. Deborah stayed in the car. Garrett came in alone, batting away a bee that had wandered through a broken pane with the same irritation he seemed to bring to most things, and Walter noticed, for the first time, the EpiPen clipped to his brother's belt, a small, ordinary detail that nearly undid him. This reminder that Garrett was, underneath the jacket and the truck and 38 years of certainty, still just a person who could be hurt by something small. That noticing didn't survive the next 4 minutes. Garrett didn't ask to see the ledger. He told Walter, flatly, that as co-executor of their father's estate, a technicality on paper that Walter had genuinely forgotten he still held, Walter carried a legal duty to disclose any known estate asset before the partition was finalized, and that failing to do so was a breach serious enough to reopen the whole agreement he said he'd already filed. He said the hearing was set for the 6th of October, 28 days out. And when Walter asked, quietly, how Garrett could possibly claim he'd had no way of knowing what was hidden here, his brother looked around the glass walls as though seeing them for the first time in his life, and said, "Because I never once set foot past that door as a kid. Dad wouldn't have it, neither would anyone else. He believed it." That was the strange part. Walter could see plainly that his brother believed every word of it. The Chester County Orphans Court doesn't look the way television has trained anyone to expect. It's a plain room, fluorescent lit, a county seal bolted slightly crooked to the wall behind the bench. Walter sat at one table with a single folder. Garrett sat at the other with 2 attorneys and a leather portfolio Deborah had bought him for the occasion. Monogrammed, the tags removed this time. Garrett's attorney made the case cleanly. Co-executors carry a fiduciary duty to disclose known estate assets before distribution. The discovery of a multi-million-dollar propagation right on property Walter had informally administered constituted exactly that kind of asset. The partition should be set aside and the value split under the original terms of the will. Walter's attorney, a former student of his in fact, 30 years out of freshman biology, working the case at a rate that amounted to a professional favor. Walter hadn't known. Nobody currently living had known. And the document that proved it, notarized and sealed in 1971, said so in the handwriting of the very man who'd hidden it. It was the second signature on that page that ended the hearing, not the first. Garrett's attorney tried, briefly, to argue the witness signature could belong to anyone. A cousin, a neighbor's kid, an unlucky coincidence of initials. It took a document examiner, referred through Priya's office, 40 minutes on the stand, to compare it against 4 decades of Garrett's later, adult signatures on file with the county and confirm, to a reasonable degree of certainty, that the unsteady hand of a 13-year-old and the confident hand of a 66-year-old developer belonged to the same person. "Mr. Pruitt," the judge said, not unkindly, "you testified 2 weeks ago that you never set foot in that greenhouse as a child." Garrett didn't answer right away. He was looking at the signature, the way a person looks at a photograph they don't remember being taken. Walter spoke only once when Garrett, cornered and reaching for something, anything, to say, muttered that this was exactly the kind of thing their father would have found funny. Leaving the real money to the one son who'd never asked for a dime of it. "You always said I got the one thing nobody else wanted," Walter said. "Turns out I got the only thing that mattered." The judge struck the petition. Afterward, in the hallway, Garrett didn't apologize. Walter hadn't expected him to, but he stood there long enough, hands in his pockets, to say something that had nothing to do with the ruling. He said he remembered that day now. Being 13, being dragged out to the greenhouse and told to sign something he didn't understand. Bored and resentful, because their father and grandfather had disappeared into that building together for an entire Saturday, and never once thought to explain why, or to ask if he wanted to come along for a reason other than being convenient. He said he'd buried the memory so completely he'd genuinely forgotten it existed, right up until he saw his own 13-year-old handwriting staring back at him from that page. "I wasn't lying in there," he said. "I really didn't remember. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't even quite an excuse. But it was the first true thing Walter had heard his brother say about that greenhouse in either of their lifetimes, and for the moment, walking out of a courthouse with an addendum folder under his arm and his brother's unanswered childhood behind him. It was enough to be getting on with. The judge's ruling didn't make Walter wealthy. The letter that arrived 6 months later did. He kept teaching, in a sense. He used part of the settlement to endow a scholarship at the high school, where he'd spent 34 years, reserved for students planning to study forestry or plant science, and part of it to fully restore the greenhouse, not as a monument, he's careful to say whenever anyone asks, but as a working nursery, propagating the resistant line under Priya's supervision for eventual reintroduction across 6 states, where a wild American chestnut hasn't grown to maturity in over a century. Garrett's firm, according to the local paper, broke ground that same spring on a 40-unit luxury development 2 towns over. Walter's fund broke ground, so to speak, on exactly 1 kid's tuition, with more names on the waiting list every year since Meg flew in for the ribbon cutting the following year, once the restoration was finished. The same daughter who'd once told her father over the phone to sign the 6/10 of an acre away for scrap and never think about it again. She spent 20 minutes photographing the chestnuts on her phone and said, only half joked that she'd like to bring her own kids out to see them someday. There was already something worth seeing. She just hadn't been looking in the right direction yet. He and Garrett aren't close. That part didn't change. And Walter has mostly stopped expecting it to. But Garrett's oldest grandson, 12, and apparently the only member of that side of the family who's ever asked a real question about the trees, has been out to the greenhouse 4 times this year. Garrett drove him the first time and stayed, without much to say, for 20 minutes at the back of the room where the chestnuts grow, before announcing he had somewhere else to be. The licensing agreement with the Eastern Woodlands Genetic Trust, the one that produced the letter Walter was holding at the very start of this account, closed on the 6th of April, 6 months to the day after the judge struck Garrett's petition from the docket. Combined with a separate appraisal of the ledger and the living specimens as irreplaceable botanical and historical material, the total came to just under $41 million. It took the county 41 more days to formally close what remained of the estate. Garrett never filed another petition on this or anything else involving the greenhouse. It took Walter the better part of a year to stop being angry that his father hadn't simply told him outright. It took him longer than that to understand why he hadn't, that some inheritances only mean anything if you're the kind of person willing to go looking for them yourself patiently, without ever being promised there's something there to find. The brass tag stamped 6 still hangs on its nail. Walter says he isn't sentimental about much. He's sentimental about that. If Walter's story moved you, subscribe for more real inheritance battles and hidden discoveries, and tell us below if a worthless family property turned out to hide a fortune. Which relative would you trust least to hear about it first?